So this is intermediate machine learning with Scikit Learn. My name is Jake Vanderplas. I'm an astronomer at University of Washington, and have been involved with the Scikit Learn project for a number of years now. And it's really cool here to be here at PyData because I've been involved in a number of the PyData conferences. Back, I think it was about a year and a half ago, was the first one. It was actually a PyData workshop that was at Google in Mountain View, and there were maybe a few dozen people there. It's a tiny little thing, and it's cool to see how this has grown to be around the country and huge numbers of participants. So anyway, it's really good to be here. I put some websites on here briefly. So just so you know, this tutorial that I'm going to be doing is drawn from a set of lectures and classes that I've given at University of Washington under Astronomy 599. So you guys get to be in an astronomy and astrophysics graduate course today. That's how it's going to work. So if you go to this top website here, that's the course info page, and it has you can download the raw notebooks themselves, but you can also look at rendered versions of the notebooks just to browse through and see what's going on. If you are on GitHub, if you use Git, I would suggest going to this bottom site here and using the Git login to fetch the notebooks from the server. Just want to make sure everyone has at least one of those websites written down, because I'm going to pull this off the screen and then go into the notebook itself. Does anyone need more time? Okay, yeah, let's take just like 2 or 3 more minutes, just to make sure everyone has it. So I guess I can just talk while you're doing that. So I got involved in Scikit Learn because I was writing some dimensionality reduction code that it was out there in the computer science literature, but I couldn't find a good usable implementation of it anywhere. So I wrote a piece of code in Python, and I thought it was interesting, so I thought I might share it. And I emailed the SciPy list and said, hey, I have this piece of code. Does anyone think they want to use it? And some of the Scikit Learn was just kind of getting off the ground back then. Gail Varco and some collaborators over at INRIA in France were working on that. And they emailed me and said, hey, why don't you contribute this? And it was such a good experience to contribute this code to a project and see people actually using it that I ended up investing a lot more time in there. So I've been helping to maintain Scikit Learn for about a little over 2 years now, and giving talks around the country like this, and hopefully helping people do effective data analysis and effective machine learning. So we have a few more people who just wandered in. I just want to say, jot down one of these, actually, jot down both these web addresses real quick, because I'm going to pull this off the board in just a second. If you use GitHub, I'd suggest using, or if you use Git, I'd suggest using the bottom address and cloning the repository. If you don't use Git, you can use the top address and take a look at the website there. So I'll assume that everyone either has it written down or can get it from their neighbor at this point. So I'm gonna take this off the board. So if you go to that top website, you'll find this web page right here. Let me make this bigger. I think I can do that. And just to kind of show you, in case you want to learn a little bit more, if you go to the schedule link here, this is all the curriculum that I've been covering in that University of Washington class. And if you scroll all the way down here, almost to the bottom, this is the Intermediate Scikit Learn Notebook. This is what we're going to be going through today. Clicking on that will bring up the rendered version of the notebook. But what I would suggest is grabbing this raw version of the notebook right here, and this will actually download the IPyNB file, and then you can run that in IPython. So because this is an intermediate tutorial, I assume that everyone's kind of up to speed and hopefully has the Anaconda distribution installed as the conference organizers recommended. We'll be using, if you have Anaconda installed, you have everything you need. And otherwise, if you have IPython Notebook, Scikit-learn, NumPy, Matplotlib, you'll be good to go. So when you open the notebook, it'll look something like this. Does everybody have, I'm going to toggle this stuff.
Jake, can you just for 1 second show back the first URL is?
Yeah, let me pull that back up again. Yeah, so once more, that top URL is the web page that has the rendered stuff on it, where you can follow along. The bottom URL has is the Git repository with all the notebooks themselves. And I wish I had another screen to keep these up while I was talking about other things. Yeah. Hopefully everybody has that. All right. Well, I'm gonna. I'll leave this up and I'll say one more thing. So this is intermediate scikit-learn. So I'm going to assume that you have some familiarity with both the concepts of machine learning and the use of the scikit-learn interface. If you don't worry too much. I think you'll still be able to follow along. And I'm going to do a quick review of those things at the beginning that. Usually would be an hour and a half tutorial, but we'll kind of breeze through them in about 15 minutes just to get everyone on the same page. But then after that, what I want to focus on here is one of the more important pieces of machine learning that sometimes is glossed over in these types of tutorials, and that's the act of validation and cross-validation and going into model selection. So the idea is that You've figured out the mechanics of machine learning. You've fit a model to your data. You're trying to predict some value, and the predictions aren't as good as you hope they would be. They're too much noise, or they're too inaccurate for what you hope. And at that point, you have to think about what is the next thing to do. How do you improve your model, or how do you get a better model that you can use to attain the prediction accuracy that you're hoping to get. So that's going to be the focus of this tutorial, about the next hour and 15 minutes or so. And yeah, we'll go kind of step by step into that. So that's the theme of this, is validating models and figuring out how to improve your model selection. So if you want to follow along with me, that'd be great. You can open up this notebook. And we're just going to go through this. I have all the material here, so essentially I'm just going to be talking through what you could read through yourself. But I want this to be as useful as possible. So if you have any questions along the way, feel free to interrupt me and raise your hand. That way we're not just simply reading through something that we can all see on the computer. Yeah, one quick question. Yeah, once again, let's just do this real quick. If you go to one of these websites here, the top website has the rendered version of the notebooks. The bottom website has the Git repository that you can download. Yeah. And after this, if you see anybody new walk in, you can maybe just nudge them and say, "Hey, I wrote this down," and show them that, so we can move on. Everyone all set? Cool. I should have gotten smaller URLs or something. I guess that's my my mistake. Okay. All right. Excellent. Let's go to the notebook now. Here we go. So again, I'm going to try to make this big enough so everyone can see here. Why is that not filling the screen? There we go. So like I said, this is an intermediate tutorial on Scikit-learn, and it'll assume that you're familiar with several things. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do something tricky here and change the style of the notebook just so it's better for the presentation. This is a pro tip here. You can go in at the beginning of the notebook if you want to, and you can insert CSS, and then the cell will basically be like hidden at the beginning, but then it'll apply that CSS to your notebook and allow you to do some more fancy things. So that's a nice way to make your notebooks look pretty good. Anyway, so there we go. So it's an intermediate tutorial, like I said, and I assume that you're already familiar with the basics of manipulating NumPy arrays, of plotting in Matplotlib, that you're familiar with the data representation, Scikit-learn, the concepts of supervised and unsupervised learning, and then the API of Scikit-learn. And even though I'm assuming that, we're going to go just briefly through all those things. But if you want to go back and brush up on that, you can go back to that. This is the link to that website I showed you a minute ago, and that has an introductory Scikit-learn notebook that goes through those things in detail. So you can check that out. So let's go on right now to a quick review of the essential concepts. These were all the things that I said I'm hoping that you know from the beginning, but just to be complete, we want to go through this. So first, the question is, what is machine learning? Machine learning is basically about building parameters that have, building algorithms that have tunable parameters. So you build a model that has parameters that can be adjusted, and then you adjust those parameters based on some input training data. And then once those parameters are in place based on that input training data, you can use that algorithm to predict aspects of new data. So for example, you might input a bunch of pictures of people's faces with labels of who these people are. And then what you would be able to do is tune the parameters within the model to kind of describe that input data set. And then when you feed it a new set of faces who you don't know who they are, the algorithm should be able to tell you which of those faces matches the training data. So you could say, this is George Bush, and this is Barack Obama, and this is Mitt Romney, for example. So it's that sort of operation, but fundamentally what it is just building a model that has tunable parameters so that you can reflect whatever data you input. So the data representation in Scikit-learn, when we talk about data, what we're talking about is essentially arrays and vectors, matrices and vectors. So the input data is what we call the feature matrix, and this in general will be a two-dimensional matrix that here we have n rows, right, by d columns, and in this point the n rows reflect the number of samples you have. So in the example I gave before, this would be the number of faces that you put in. The D features here are the number of features for each example. So for a data set of people's faces, these features might be some sort of metric like the distance between the eyes or the distance from the eyes to the nose or the nose to the mouth, that sort of thing. That's more of a high-level feature. Or you can use a low-level feature like even the brightness of each pixel as a function of position on the image. So the important thing, though, is that the features have to be uniform between all the samples. You can't have one data point that has distances measured between eyes and nose and forehead and things like that, and another data point that only has the pixel values. You need the features to be uniform, and that way they can fit in this n by d matrix. Now the label vector is a one-dimensional vector, which we usually denote y here. And that one-dimensional vector gives some sort of numeric label of whatever, of each of the objects. So the first element of y corresponds to the first row of x, second element corresponds to the second row, etc. And these label vectors are usually numerical, right? So you can't really put strings in there because the algorithms don't know what to do with strings. So generally the label vectors are just 0, 1, 2 representing different classes. Or perhaps for a continuous value, they might be a floating point value somewhere in between. So if you have distinct values, we call that classification. And if you have continuous values, we call that regression. And hopefully you've come across those concepts before. So here's Scikit-learn has actually, I want to clear all this data real quick. I'm just going to clear all the outputs so I can kind of run it as we go. I'm going to restart the kernel just to make sure everything is in place. So Scikit-learn has a number of data sets built in that you can use to try algorithms out and just to see how they work. And I'm going to show you one of those here. This is the iris data set that's, for some reason, has been used in machine learning examples for decades. It's kind of funny because no one in real life actually does machine learning on irises anymore. But it's a good example anyway. So what you can do is import this datasets module and then call the load iris function, and that loads the data set. And the keys in this data set show you what's available there. We have lots of stuff, but the most interesting ones are the data and the target. So we're going to call x the data, and y is the target. And if we print the shape of x and y, we see what they are here. So we have, for x and y, we have 150 features, 150 samples and 4 features. So x is a two-dimensional array of the number of features by the number of samples. Sorry, I keep flipping that. Number of samples by the number of features. And y is a one-dimensional array that just is the length, the number of samples. And I basically said that here. The number of samples, number of features is the shape of x, and then you want the length of the labels to match the number of samples there. And just, I want to keep this toolbar here. Just to show you, you can actually do, if you do datasets dot, in the IPython notebook, if you do datasets dot and then press tab, you can see all these different datasets that are available there. And there, on the Scikit-learn website, there are examples of classification and regression problems on these datasets and other learning things you can do. So this is just a really nice way to try some different things out. So we mentioned this briefly, but really quick, let's talk about what the features and the labels mean. So in the case of the iris, if we print the feature names, we see that they're the length of the sepal. Let me scan this up. The length of sepal, length of width of sepal, length of petal, width of petal, and these feature names here is it's just a list of the features. So feature 0 is the sepal length, feature 1 is the sepal width, etc. So this is kind of that high-level feature data that we were talking about, right? Measurements of the individual objects and putting in some sort of domain knowledge. Like the botanists who put this data set together obviously thought that the length and the width of the petals and sepals were an interesting piece that would help classify these irises, right? You could imagine just taking pictures of each of the irises in some way and doing machine learning on that. But those lower level features are sometimes can be harder to fit. There's not quite as much compressed information in those features. So I bring this up because this is a really important point, this kind of feature engineering point in Scikit-learn, or in machine learning in general. If you want to do machine learning, you have to decide what your features are going to be. And a lot of times that requires some domain knowledge. So for example, in my field, in astronomy, we don't necessarily do our learning of figuring out what astronomical objects are by just looking at the pictures, at the pixel level data of those objects and doing some blind learning algorithm. We actually have a lot of background we put in a lot of theoretical background about knowing, for example, what traits might be interesting for the problems we're wanting to solve, whether it's the brightness or the color or the spectral distribution or the extent on or the shape on the sky. So that is all feature engineering, and this is one thing that is often glossed over in machine learning because it tends to be really, really hard. If you want to do effective machine learning on your own data sets, you have to have some sort of understanding about what features will be the most important to look at. There are ways to do that blindly and to kind of figure out the important features based on things like decision trees. But in general, if you want to do machine learning effectively, you have to have some understanding of what the data is that you're looking at and what is most important and what should be used for the features. So since that's such a broad problem and depends on fields, we won't cover it here, and generally machine learning tutorials don't cover that, but it's probably 80 or 90% of machine learning is figuring out those features, feature engineering. So keep that in mind. You generally can't just throw data at one of these algorithms and have it give you something meaningful. You have to think about what that data is. Yeah?
Do you suggest any textbook or any other places where we can find the best methodologies or techniques to find this feature?
Yeah, she asked if there's any textbook I suggest that would help in the methodology of feature engineering. I can't think of one in particular, and the reason is that in the work that I do, the feature engineering aspects come out of an understanding from doing graduate work in astronomy. So there wasn't really any single textbook that was helpful in that. I would say for the feature engineering parts, you should look for some reference that's specific to your own field that you're wanting to get into. And wanting to look at, because like I said, that part requires some domain understanding, and I wouldn't be able to stand up here and tell you off the top of my head what features are interesting for your own problems necessarily. So here's an example of some lower level features that we'll look at. If we look at the digits data set, we're going to call this load digits function. And we can see the shape of that is 1797 by 64. So we have 1797 samples and 64 features. One of the nice things about the notebook is you can plot graphics in line. So here we're going to load this matplotlib inline. If you have, this works on IPython 1.0. If you have an older version of IPython, you're going to want to replace this with Pylab inline. There's a subtle difference between the two, but the new one, matplotlib inline, is better if you have IPython 1.0 or higher. And here we'll create our matplotlib figure, and I'm just going to plot, take this data and reshape it into an 8x8 array, and then plot a bunch of them. So we see here are the low-level features that we're looking at in the digits data set. We're looking at the pixels themselves. So these 64 features are just the brightness of the 64 pixels in the image. And for data like this, it's actually surprising sometimes how well you can do. Well, so we'll see later an example of doing some classification and some other machine learning on this digits data. So as we get into, I just remembered I can go full screen. Ooh, that's even better. Yes. Awesome. So as we get into this, we'll talk about the two main categories of machine learning, which are supervised and unsupervised learning. So supervised learning is basically concerns labeled data. So when you hear supervised, think labeled. Supervised, labeled. So with labeled data, what you're training your algorithm to do is, based on a training set that has labels, you want to be able to predict labels for a test set that doesn't have labels. So in the case of the digits up here, imagine you have a whole bunch of digits that you put in, and you know what the true value of each of these are. Because, for example, maybe you have a human look at it, or you have the person who wrote the digit tell you what they intended to write. And then you might have a set of new digits where you don't know the labels. And after you train your supervised algorithm, you put in those new digits and you'll get out the labels that you were hoping for. So unsupervised is a little bit different. So unsupervised has to do with unlabeled data. So remember, supervised is labeled, unsupervised is unlabeled. And when you have unlabeled data, what unsupervised algorithms are trying to do is find some sort of structure in the data that can give you clues about the nature of the data set itself. And if that sounds a little bit wishy-washy, it's because unsupervised learning is a really, really big category of algorithms. And there are many different things you can do, from dimensionality to reduction to clustering to feature engineering type operations where you're trying to figure out what is most important within the data set. But so, for example, in the digits data, one unsupervised learning algorithm might be to determine which digits are related. So you might be able to cluster those digits in space and figure out, well, these all look kind of the same, so we'll say that those are the same digit. And unsupervised learning can be really interesting. I use it in astronomy a lot to basically look for different classes of sources in a bunch of data that when I'm not sure what's there. Things like finding outliers in a distribution. So unsupervised learning can be really interesting for that. And when you have 10 billion astronomical sources and you want to figure out what's interesting out there, you don't want to look at 10 billion different images or 10 billion different objects by eye. So I'm going to do right here a really quick demonstration of a supervised learning task and an unsupervised learning task in Scikit-learn. And this will show you kind of the main features of the Scikit-learn interface. So let's talk through this little piece of code right here. What we're going to do is import this Gaussian NB. This is a Scikit-learn estimator. An estimator in Scikit-learn is basically a container for a class of algorithms or a class of models that you can use. So we're going to use this digits data that we saw before, this x and y. And the first part of doing a machine learning operation is, whoa, why did that go away? There we go. First part of a machine learning operation is to instantiate the estimator. I just lost where I was. There we go. So instantiating it means basically calling the class and returning this object. And here Gaussian naive Bayes doesn't take any parameters, but this is where if you have parameters for your estimator, this is where you can decide what those are. And then we call the fit method. So fit takes, in the case of supervised learning, takes an X array, which is a two-dimensional array, a Y array, which is one-dimensional. And here we're just going to take the first, all but the last 5 of X and all but the last 5 labels. And then when you want to predict, when you want to know the labels of some new data, you call this predict method. And here we'll predict on the last 5 digits that the algorithm wasn't trained on. So when we take that prediction, we can compare it to, here we'll compare it to the input, and we'll see how well this algorithm did. So let's execute that. And we see that, yeah, basically the algorithm was able to predict correctly these 5 digits, that it's a 9, a 0, an 8, a 9, and an 8. So is that clear? These are the basic steps of using a Scikit-learn estimator. You instantiate it with some sort of parameters, with model parameters. You fit the algorithm to your data. You predict on new data, and then you can compare. If you have known values here, you can compare to see how well you did. So this is a basic validation exercise, right? We know the true labels of these 5 points, and we've predicted those 5 labels, and now we're doing a comparison and saying, yeah, we did pretty well. So we can do a little more detailed comparison here by doing what's called a confusion matrix, and this is using the metrics submodule in Scikit-learn. There are lots of different metrics that you can use, but we're going to use metrics.confusion matrix. And what we do is we're doing similar to what we did above, except we're predicting for the whole data set. And the confusion matrix, you pass it the true values and the predicted values. And what it does is gives you a matrix of true versus predicted and how many of each of those there were. So let me execute this and you can see. So what this says is here are the true values. If your true value was a 2, you have a somewhat good chance of landing on an 8 there. So it's saying that this, sorry? It's saying that this algorithm somehow, because of the way the algorithm is constructed, it confuses 2s and 8s. So this is a good thing to know about your algorithm, and this is something that if you're doing multi-class classification like this, you might want to think about what's going on. But it looks like 0. It classifies 0 pretty well. It doesn't really get 0 mistaken with anything else. So confusion matrix is a nice way that you can kind of look at the performance of your algorithm and see what's going on. We'll return to that in a.
What's the scale on the right side?
Sorry?
The scale on the right side. What?
Oh, the scale. This is the number of samples that fall in each of those bins. So right here we have I guess 170 zeros that all were classified as 0. Yeah, question. Yeah, that's a good question. So he asked if this should be symmetric, and it shouldn't necessarily be symmetric because you have you're basically going from the input, this true value here, to the output, which is the predicted value. And so, for example, as an extreme example, oh, I lost my signal. I'm not going to touch that. As an extreme example, imagine an algorithm that calls everything 0, right? Your matrix would just be a stripe right here, and it wouldn't be symmetric. So if you have bias in your algorithm, it'll induce kind of an asymmetry there. It's a good question. And there's another thing. If we don't want to look at this full confusion matrix, we can do something that's just kind of a summary of that. If we use metrics.accuracy score, this can be a useful validation method. You print the accuracy score, and we see that for this model, we have about 82% of the classifications are correct. And I mean, you could do this yourself, right? You could count the number of y and yprid that are equal, and then divide it by the number total. But it's just nice to have convenience methods to do those common operations.
For every single prediction, does it give you an estimate of how confident it was about that prediction?
Yeah, the question was about confidence intervals. So you can get an estimate of confidence on those predictions. The way you would do that is instead of calling predict right here, you'd call it predict proba. And this predict proba, which I guess is short for probability, gives you a probabilistic estimate of it'll say, well, I think that it returns a 2D array that tells you this is 60% an 8 or maybe 40% a 2. But if you just call predict by itself, it'll only give you the best answer. In general, confidence intervals for prediction are they don't always fit. Not every method has that, and there are ways to deal with that. But that's kind of more. It's a little bit more advanced topic, and you can look at the literature on each algorithm to figure out the most effective way to do those confidence intervals. So let's go to unsupervised learning now. So looking at these digits, and unsupervised learning, one method you might want to use with unsupervised learning is to use it for visualization. So we have here 1,700 or so samples in 64 dimensions. If this were in 2 or 3 dimensions, we'd just be able to plot those as points in 2 or 3 dimensions, right? But I don't know of any software that can do 64-dimensional plots, and I don't know if I could visualize that myself. So often when we have high-dimensional data like this, it can help to reduce the dimension in order to see the relationships between the points. So one way you could do this, you could reduce the dimension, is to use a random projection, right? So we're going to create this projection matrix, which is 64 by 2. And then we're just going to dot our data into that projection matrix, and that'll return a a two-dimensional random projection. It kind of, if you imagine taking points in 3D, what we're doing is we're orienting these points and then flattening them along the third axis, except we're doing that 62 times. We're flattening the data 62 times. So if we do that, we get this is a random projection of the data, and it shows you on the y-axis is the label from 0 to 9, and the the color axis is the label, and the x and y-axis are just kind of meaningless dimensions that sort of spread the points out. And we can see that this is not very enlightening. You might look at this and say, well, the yellows are all sort of near each other, and the oranges are kind of split apart. But this doesn't give you much insight into the data. So this is where an unsupervised learning algorithm might come in. So a common one that's used because it's very fast and very interpretable is principal component analysis. So this is in scikit-learn.decomposition.pca. And unsupervised learning looks a lot like supervised learning. We instantiate the model, and here this model has parameters. We're going to say that we want number of components to be 2. And then we're going to fit the model to our data. And no, yeah.
What if you don't put that argument in?
Oh, if you don't put the number of components in? Yeah, if you, from scalar, let me do that real quick.
I thought PCA is supposed to figure out for you what
Yeah.
the most important dimensions are.
So, yeah, PCA can do that. If you look at the documentation string of PCA, you can do that by just putting a question mark after that. It will show you all this documentation. And what it says here with n components, if you don't set anything, how does set? Yeah, if you don't set anything, it'll just keep all components. But then you can pass things like MLE, which will guess the dimension. Or you can pass a floating point between 0 and 1, and that'll tell you the variance that you want to keep in that. So yeah, there are different ways to estimate what the best number of components are, and scikit-learn implements those. So here, though, because we're just doing it for visualization, we know we want 2 components because we want to be able to visualize this on a flat piece of paper. So we fit the model, and notice we don't pass the y values here. We're not passing the labels. So it's just operating on the data itself, kind of taking the data for what they are. And then instead of the predict, these dimensionality reduction methods have a transform operator, a transform method. So we're going to call model.transform and then print the shape of the result, and then we're going to plot the result here. So you can see that the shape that came out is 1797 by 2. So what we've done is we've projected these 1700 or 1800 samples into 2 dimensions. And when we plot those, we see that this is much easier to make sense of than the random projection right here, right? So what PCA has done is it's found the principal axes in the data and said these are the directions in the data that are the most important in some senses, important in terms of having the maximum variance. And this tells us a little bit about the data, right? So we saw before that zeros were really, really well classified. And that makes sense because these zeros kind of live all by themselves out in this part of the parameter space. And the other thing we were looking at was 2s and 8s, right? So here are the 2s, here are the 8s. And if we look at those, we see that they really overlap in parameter space here. So this sort of operation can tell us about our data and help us see what's going on in the background. And if you go on the scikit-learn website, there's an example of doing this with PCA and then also some nonlinear dimensionality reduction methods that actually separate the data even better. So that can be an interesting thing. So this was the end of the kind of quick review. The stuff that I just went through in, I guess that was about 20 minutes. I would usually take an hour and a half or 2 hours to kind of go through that in detail. And if you want that level of detail on those things, you can find, I think some of the past PyDatas. There are videos online of some of my tutorials. There's also some other excellent tutorials that you can find online. Just search scikit-learn tutorial. Question back there.
So one thing that I've sort of haven't really gotten down with scikit-learn is like you fit some model, you have it, and then
Yeah, that's a good question. He was asking, once you have a model that you're happy with, what do you do with it if you want to use it later? Do you have to refit it every time, or can you save it? One thing we've tried to do, and I think without exception we have done in scikit-learn, is make all the models pickleable. So if you call, you import cpickle, and if you don't know what pickling is, it's just a way of serializing Python objects. So you save them in a file, and then you can load them later and get them exactly how they were. So look up, if you're interested in doing that, look up pickling and the cpickle module in particular online, and you can basically just pickle your estimator and pull it back later. There are some problems with that being compatible between different versions of Python, and for specific models, you can do some more sophisticated things that might be compatible, from say 2.6 to 2.7 or even to 3.3 or whatever. Yeah, right now pickling is the recommended way. Like I said, pickling is just a object serialization in Python. So look up Python pickle, and I don't think there are any weird Google hits you'd get for that, but you never know. Pickling for object serialization, for saving objects to use at a later date. So let's get into the meat of this tutorial now. This idea of measuring the performance of a classifier or a regression algorithm or an unsupervised learning. So we saw this before with the confusion matrix, with computing the accuracy and that kind of thing. But those sorts of metrics are not always the best thing to do with your data. And I'm going to show you an example of why this is. So we're going to look at the k-neighbors classifier. And this is a really nice classification algorithm because it's really easy to understand. Basically, it saves all the training data, and then it computes, it computes in a Euclidean sense. It computes the distance between any unknown point and the training point. And it says, what's the nearest neighbor or the k nearest neighbors of this new point in the original data set, and it then votes on what the result should be. So we're going to load the digits again as we did before. We're going to instantiate the k nearest neighbors classifier, and we're going to say that we want the number of neighbors to be 1. So this just says, take the nearest neighbor of this point and give it that label. As before, we call the fit method, we call the predict method, and then we can get out the classification accuracy. So let's do this right now. And what we find is with the k nearest neighbors classifier, our classification accuracy is 100%, and our confusion matrix looks perfect, right? So does this mean that we've found a foolproof perfect classifier? It's one of those obvious questions where everyone's just supposed to I don't know. No, this is not a foolproof perfect classifier. And the reason is because we're training on the same data that we're validating with. So we've said, take all these data points, and our model is that the nearest point is the estimate. And then we feed it the exact same data points. So obviously the nearest point of each point is going to be itself, right? That distance is 0. So what we've done here is we've basically created an algorithm that memorizes the data, and then when we feed it that same data back at itself, it spits out the memorized result. So this is not a good classification algorithm, even though it says that the prediction is 100%, and it says that our confusion matrix is a perfect diagonal. So this is the reason that what we really need to do when we do this sort of validation is we want to split our data into training and testing portions. So this is really, really important, and I think I've seen a lot of situations where people forget this, and they they think that their model is performing a lot better than it actually is. The k-neighbors model, I use this because this is an extreme example, but even for models that don't particularly memorize the data, you can fool yourself into thinking you have a much better model than you actually do. So the basic way to approach this is to split your data, and there's this function called train test split here, and And what you do is if you feed in your data set, the x and y, and you tell it what size you want your test set to be, it will spit out two different sets of the data. It'll split it into two pieces. So the training set with 70% of the data, and the test set with 30% of the data. So let's run this. And we see, yeah, the training set has about 1,300 samples. The test set has about 540. And now what we're going to do is we're going to train our classifier here, the same one, the nearest neighbors classifier, with just the training data. And then we're going to call the predict method on just the test data. And now let's take a look at what the classification accuracy and the confusion matrix are for that. So now we see it's a little more realistic, right? It's 98% classification accuracy, which actually is pretty good, given that this is such a kind of a silly estimator. We're just finding the nearest neighbor and calling the point stat. Yeah, so it's a 98% accuracy, and there's it's hard to see with the resolution of the screen, but there are a few off-diagonal pieces here that are showing you where there's little bits of confusion in the algorithm. So when you're doing this sort of validation, the training and testing split is a very important piece. So keep that in mind if you want to evaluate how well your models are doing. And I even put it in bold because it's so important. Always do the train test split. So another thing that's interesting about, actually I should pause to see if there are any questions on that, the train test split piece of it. Yeah. Yeah, we'll get that. He was asking about k-fold cross-validation, which is basically a more sophisticated way of doing this data splitting. And yeah, Scikit-learn has that built in, and we'll actually get to it in a few minutes. Another question. What about multi-classes? Yeah, so a lot of this works for multi-classes as well, and you'll notice that the digits data is actually multi-class, right? We have 10 classes of data. And different algorithms, some algorithms support multi-class well, and others are better at just binary classification. But you can look at the documentation of each of the particular estimators to see how they handle that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Great, thanks. So let's look at some other validation metrics. We saw the confusion matrix, we saw the accuracy score, but these are not always sufficient for the types of things that we want to do. So what I'm going to do here is just create an unbalanced data set. And instead of going through what all that is doing, if I just plot it, you'll sort of see what's going on. What I did is I created a data set that has a whole bunch of background sources. That's these green sources here. And it has a few foreground sources that we're interested in. This looks a whole lot like a problem that I've worked on in astronomy, which is finding variable stars. We have these traits of stars and or certain classes of stars that are very rare but very interesting. So you have maybe several million background sources, and you're looking for 100 of these little proverbial needles in the haystack. And the classification and the validation of algorithms gets a little bit tricky in this case, as we'll see. So what we're looking for here is these gray points are the points that are kind of interesting to us, that we want to be able to find. And the green points are the points that are, sort of not as interesting. We consider them background. So let's take a look at a classifier here. And I actually, instead of just listening to me the whole time, I want you guys to get a chance to do this. So on your own computer, we're going to use the SVC, which is the support vector classifier. And I want you to split the data as we did above, fit a model to the training data, compute yprid, the predicted labels, and then once that's finished, print this accuracy here, and let me know what you get with that. We'll take about 5 minutes to run through that, and I'll walk around if you have any questions as you work on that.
Should you give any parameters to SVC classifier?
Oh yeah, SVC takes some parameters, but for right now, just leave the parameters at their defaults, just for simplicity. Has anyone gotten that accuracy score yet?
97%.
What'd you get?
97%.
97%? Is that about what other people got? Yeah. Okay. So I know there's probably a lot of you who haven't finished this yet, but I just wanted to get you thinking a little bit. So I know I was ready to fall asleep this morning because I'm on Pacific time. So someone said that if you do this, you ended up with an accuracy of somewhere around 97%, right? So you might think 97%, that's pretty good. We're doing well on our data. You know, we're almost at 100. But the problem is that we're not in that 97% that we get out of that. We're not distinguishing between the signal and the background. We're not distinguishing the things that we're really interested in. So I did the answer to this problem right here really quick. So you split the data as we did above. You do SVC and you fit X train and Y train. I did a little shortcut here. When you call the fit method, it returns the classifier itself. So you can do things in one line if you want. And then we'll predict on the test data, and then we're going to print here several different scores. We have the accuracy score, which, as we said, was about 97%. But there are also these scores that can be interesting for unbalanced data like this. We have the precision, which it says precision is 83%. The recall is only 63%. And the F1 score is 72%. So whatever these precision recall and F1 score are, they're not, they're indicating that this is not doing as well as the accuracy says it is. So let's take a look at these precision recall and accuracy. So the accuracy is, this one's pretty obvious. It's just the number of correct labels divided by the number of total samples, right? And that's sort of intuitive. That makes sense to us. But when thinking about these signals and background, the precision and recall are more interesting. So what the precision gives you is the true positives. That means the true signal, or the true foreground objects that we actually label as foreground objects, divided by the total number that we call foreground objects. So precision, think about it this way. If we're trying to find this rare form of star, our algorithm tells us that we have all these rare forms of stars. The precision tells you how many of those items labeled rare star are actually a rare star. And in our case here, the precision was 83%. So that says out of all the items that are labeled 1, 83% of them are actually number 1. Okay? The recall is a little bit different. The recall, what it's saying is true positives divided by true positives plus false negatives. So it's saying out of all the samples that are actually this rare class in reality, how many of them are we pulling out in this classification? Right, so and the recall in this case is 63%. So it says that out of all those interesting objects we're looking for, this algorithm is only finding 63% of them. And it finds those 63% with a precision of about 84. Right? Does that all make sense? Yeah, so if you're in a situation that looks like this, where the interesting objects that you're looking for, the interesting items, are far outnumbered by the uninteresting items, the accuracy is not what you're going to want to be looking at. So because precision and recall are such interesting measures, sometimes you don't know whether you want to be precise or whether you want to have good recall. These are related to completeness and contamination, which is more the nomenclature in my own field. And there are other names that are used in various fields that all sort of mean some version of precision and recall. But the F1 score is a way of combining the precision and recall into one metric. So if you multiply precision times recall over precision plus recall, and I think there has to be a factor of a half in there. I probably forgot that. It's 0.5 times. Yeah, did that work? Yeah. So F1 is 0.5 times the precision times recall over the precision plus recall. And if you do the math on this, the F1 score will also be between 0 and 1. And it just combines those two metrics. So if you're interested in a summary of this precision recall F1 score, there's this really handy function called the classification report in Scikit-learn. And if you call the classification report, you get this little, and print it, you get this little table that says for the background objects, our precision is 97%, recall is 99%, F1 score is 98, etc. And we get those numbers out for the foreground objects as well.
How did you specify background and foreground when you printed the first set of metrics?
What?
So, I mean, like the first row corresponds to background and background, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So if you scroll up, yeah, this first set.
Oh, in this first set?
Yeah.
Yeah, so when you compute this, it's basically the precision score and the recall score. They're basically assuming that it's a binary classification with 1 being the foreground and 0 being the background, which is how we set it up. So you could finagle that a little bit to find the precision of any other, of treating the other one as the foreground and the background if you wanted. But the nice thing is that this this classification report does that all for you. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the F1 score? Like, what is the way to sort of physically think about it?
That's a good question. So the question is, how do we physically think about the F1 score? What does it really mean? I've never really wrapped my mind around it that way. You know, I just think of it as like a way of combining precision and recall so that both of them contribute equally. And then it's better than just adding them together because you get a score that's between 0 and 1. There might be a better way of thinking about it, but I don't know. Did I? And also, I think this should be a 2, shouldn't it? Yeah. Is that right? Yeah, that should be a 2 times this. Because it's got to be between 0 and 1. That's what happens when you think on your feet. There's another question over here. Yeah.
So most algorithms minimize some error function that's the net likelihood or something. Can you make that maximize the F1 score instead?
Maximize the F1 score rather than the likelihood?
Right.
Oh, that's a good question. So he was saying most machine learning algorithms are built upon maximum likelihood principle. So they're trying to maximize some sort of likelihood. And he was asking if you could make the algorithm maximize the F1 score instead of the likelihood. The problem is in order to get the F1 score, you need to have a fitted model, right? So what you're really talking about there is model selection or hyperparameter selection, which is a piece of what we do. You know, you're basically rather than fitting the parameters to the data, you're fitting the hyperparameters to the validation data. And in that sense, you do some sort of optimization of the F1 score or the accuracy or the precision or whatever you're interested in. And we'll see something like that a little bit later. Does that answer your question? Cool. Okay. Sorry? Oh, she asked about optimization methods for this. It really depends on the algorithm. Some algorithms use a theoretical optimization. Some use things like gradient descent or different things, stochastic gradient descent, things like that. It really, if you're curious about those internals about each of the algorithm, you can look on the documentation and there's information about that. So so what's going on here is, just in summary, the accuracy is not always the best measure of how well you're doing for the problem you want to solve. So let's take do another quick exercise and basically repeat what we did above here, but do it for the k-neighbors classifier, the Gaussian naive Bayes classifier, and the support vector machine classifier using the default parameters. And with this, print out the classification report and tell me, or figure out which of these three you might want to use for this particular problem, if you're interested in finding these interesting objects in the background. It'll take a few minutes to do that. Yeah. So I want to show you how I would approach this, and this is one of the reasons the scikit-learn interface is really nice, because you can do something like this. You can say for model in SVC, k-neighbors classifier, and what was the other one that I talked to you? Gaussian naive Bayes. So in that for loop, you just call the model, and since it's all a uniform interface, you can let's print the model here. Since it's all a uniform interface, you can just cycle through those models and do the same thing on each one, right? And pull out the results. So let's do that. So for SVC, we see that the precision, like we saw above, is 83 and the recall is 63. For k-nearest neighbors, it's about the same, 71 and 63. And for Gaussian naive Bayes, it's about 85 and 75. So just by using the default parameters for these different algorithms, we're getting different performance in terms of these things. And look, you might not notice this if you just looked at the accuracy score itself. They're all around 96, 97. But the Gaussian naive Bayes is significantly better in terms of the precision and the recall. So this can be a nice thing to do once you have your data and you just want to kind of figure out which model to use. You can cycle through different models and look at various accuracy or precision scores. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah, I just think scikit-learn is so cool in that everything has the same interface and you can do it this way. And other packages that I've come across don't necessarily make things that easy. So let's get to the next topic. Oh, question.
Would you hazard a guess about why Gaussian naive Bayes perform the best?
He's asking why Gaussian naive Bayes perform the best. So, yeah. So in this case, these are three different classes of algorithms. The SVC is a discriminative algorithm, It draws a line between two samples, essentially. K-neighbors is a non-parametric algorithm which tries to be model-free in some senses. And Gaussian naive Bayes is fitting a Gaussian to each distribution. And I think the reason Gaussian naive Bayes was most successful here is because the data was generated from Gaussians. So the Gaussian naive Bayes basically has the optimal model for the data that we put in. Yeah. So maybe a little bit contrived, but yeah, Gaussian naive Bayes, I should say in general, Gaussian naive Bayes is not a very good algorithm to use. Its advantage is that it's very, very fast and very easy to understand and interpret, so it's a good kind of baseline for doing some other things. But in general, something like SVC, especially if you do hyperparameter optimization, will be a lot better at this sort of problem. Yeah?
If you know that your data has a Gaussian distribution, or you can interpret it, you can throw that in. You're probably going to get it.
Yeah. If you know that your data has a Gaussian distribution, that's true. You could use Gaussian naive Bayes, and there are other naive Bayes methods like multinomial naive Bayes. So if you know your data fits a multinomial distribution, you can do that. So this is where kind of having that domain knowledge about what the data is and thinking about your data rather than just throwing algorithms at it can be really helpful. So good question. So let's go on to this, cross-validation. Someone asked about this earlier. Cross-validation is basically a way of doing more sophisticated splits between your training data and your test data. So if you think about the X-train and the X-test that we did before, the problem is here that we're ignoring a portion of our data, right? We're just training on, say, half the data, and we're testing on the other half. But what if we want to know what's going on in that other half of the data as well? One way you can imagine doing that is by doing the simplest way is you can split and kind of do a two-pass thing. So here, instead of X-train and X-test, we're just going to call it X1 and X2. And we're going to do a test size of 0.5. So our data has, we have 500 points in each. And now what we'll do is we'll first fit our model on component 1 and predict on component 2. And then we'll fit our model on component 2 and predict on component 1. And now our precision score then will be the mean of these two, the precision score for the first sample and the precision score for the second sample. Does that make sense what we're doing? We're kind of taking what was a one-phase thing and we're turning it into a two-phase thing. This is why it's called cross-validation, because we're validating on one part of the data set and then using the test data to validate back on the training data, essentially. So if we do that, we get something similar to what we saw before, precision around 80%. So this is this scheme that I just did by hand here is known as two-fold cross-validation. We have two folds, right, and we're validating on one of those folds at a time. And this is a specific instance of something more general that's called k-fold cross-validation. So you can imagine instead of splitting your data into two pieces, you split your data into, say, 10 pieces, and you fit on 9 of them and then test with the 10th. And then you cycle through and use each of those folds as a test set. Now we wouldn't want to do that by hand. That would be a lot of code to write it like this, right? So scikit-learn has these cross-validation routines in there, and there's a lot in there. If you're interested in this, you should look at the cross-validation module and the different routines and classes that are available. But the highest level, kind of easiest to conceptualize interface is this cross-val score. And the way you do it is you do cross-val, you call a cross-val score and you pass it whatever estimator you're interested in, and you pass it the data set you're interested in, and you tell it how many validation folds you want to be. So here we're going to say we want 2 folds, and we say that our scoring that we're interested in is the precision. So let's execute this, and we get what comes out of the cross-val score is the precision, or the scoring for each of those samples. So it gets a 73 and it gets an 87, and if you average these, you get something like 80 that we saw before. Right? So this is nice because you can do in one line what it took 3-4 lines for us to do up here. And you can really easily do something like, if you want to switch this to many more, you can do 20 folds. And then you get for, well, 20 folds was, we don't have enough data for that. It's not finding all the samples in all the folds. So if we do that, yeah, we see that some of the folds get perfect precision. Some of them get really, really bad precision. But if we average all these out, we get an idea of how the data set is doing as a whole. We get a much less noisy estimate of the precision.
Do you have a method that will take a certain size and then randomly sample that size?
Yeah, this is actually doing random sampling.
Right, but selecting the size versus the test, the cut that you're doing. Here you're cutting into 5 pieces, so the precision of your algorithm is going to go down with less sampling, less training. So can you say, I want to train with, let's say, 90% of the data, but I want you to pick 10 cases randomly?
Oh yeah. So the question is how can you specify the training and the testing sizes? What this is actually doing is it's so if we do tenfold, it's taking 90% of the data and training on that, and then fitting with the last 10%, and then it shuffles it again and takes the other 90% and fits on the 10%. So we're not fitting on just one fold. We're fitting on n-1 or k-1 folds. It's not. You can think about it as a rolling window, I guess. But, yeah.
Can you impose that the cross-validation, the validation set mirrors the sample of the training set?
Oh yeah, that's his question was, can you impose that the validation set mirrors the sample? You mean in the number of pluses and minuses? Yeah. Yeah, what you want to use for that, and this is you can do from sklearn.cross-validation import stratified k-folds. So these are two cross-validation methods. The stratified k-fold and the stratified shuffle split, I think, address both of your questions. The stratified k-fold does the k-fold, except make sure the balance of labels stays constant. And stratified shuffle split does something, I think, similar to what you were asking.
And do you think so that may actually artificially reduce the variance?
Yeah, there can be some really subtle effects in we're not talking about effects at like the 1% level, but effects at the 0.01% level that can depend on exactly how you do your cross-validation. And those are, if you're a machine learning geek, you can get into lots of fun discussions, and there are lots of articles written about that sort of thing. But for kind of order one purposes, something like a k-fold or a stratified k-fold can usually be sufficient for this sort of thing. There's actually a discussion on the Scikit-learn mailing list a while ago about something like that. This, an assumption that went into stratified k-fold that was ending up biasing the results in some situations. So, yeah.
So the cross-validation is only telling you how your model scored, right? So does it mean? So how is that affecting the model, like in what you described?
Yeah, so the question was the cross-validation only tells you how the model scored. But you can imagine if you split the data in a silly way, right? If you maybe put one split that only has one of the samples that you're interested in, or another split that has all of the samples that you're interested in, that doesn't reflect the data set as a whole, so it can bias the results. So like I said, it's a really subtle effect. Maybe if you want to talk about the details of it, we can meet afterwards. I'm going to skip this exercise because basically what it's doing is allowing you to pass a different hyperparameter fit a series of models with a series of different hyperparameters, and then plot what the cross-validation score is. And the reason I'm going to skip this is because there's a much nicer way to do it. This is one of those exercises that has you do something hard that takes a long time, and then I say, but there's a nice way to do this without doing all that hard work. So let's just skip to doing it the nice way with grid search. Yeah, this is good for class. This is the stuff I make my students do, but I won't make you do it right now. Yeah, so that exercise is an example of a grid search. So cross-validation through grid search means that we're basically going to say, given a certain choice of model parameters, how well does this model do? And then we want to compare all different choices of model parameters and see what goes, how we can fit the best model. So there's a nice example for this. It's called Grid Search CV. This is a meta-estimator. It's an estimator of estimators. And what it allows you to do is automate this grid search. So, for example, let's say we're looking at the support vector classification, and support vector machines take a parameter C, which basically gives the I won't describe what it gives, but it affects the model where the cutoff happens. And there are all sorts of other what we call hyperparameters here, but let's just focus on the C right now. So if we just create the model, and then we say that our C range, we want it somewhere between 10 to the minus 2 and 10 to the 2. So 0.01 up to 100, and we're going to try 40 different samples. And now this grid search CV is an estimator just like the other estimators that we've seen, except it takes an estimator as a parameter. So we're going to pass this SVC as a parameter to grid search. And we're going to say the param grid is a dictionary that gives the parameter names and the range of the values. And then again, we'll say that we're interested in the precision, and we want to do 5 cross-validations at each step. And then because this is an estimator, you just call fit x and y. So we're fitting this to the data set. And we find that the best parameter choice out of those 40 grid points is a C of 0.1. Right? Yeah.
Where do you specify the actual cross-validation method that you use?
Yeah, that's right here. So if you, in CV equals 5, what I've said is I want to do a 5-fold, k-fold cross-validation with 5 folds. You can actually pass one of these. Up here I mentioned the stratified k-fold or stratified shuffle split. You could actually pass one of those objects here instead if you want to use a different, more sophisticated cross-validation. But the easiest way to do it is just to say a number, and it does k-fold. Yeah?
Is there a lot of significance in your spacing your C values over a logarithmic scale?
He asked if there's significance in spacing the C values over logarithmic scale. It's because in the case of SVC, this C range tends to there are a lot of valid things. So the fact you can have a C that goes down to 0.01 and a C that goes to 100. And I've just found in practice that cross-validating support vector machines, it's best to use a logarithmic scale because of the range. So, yeah.
And your parent grid, if you had another key that, for example, iterated over different parameters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could put another parameter in this param grid, and then instead of doing a one-dimensional grid, it would do a two-dimensional grid and try all combinations of values. And it would give you the best. So it's sometimes interesting to visualize this. So in the param grid, let's say we want to get the C value here for all the fit grid scores, and we can print the result. And I'll use a semi-log x, and this is what we get. So we see that right around 0.1, we're getting a precision of nearly 100%. Maybe, and what was it? Yeah, around 0.1, our precision is near 100%. So this is saying that there's a particular place in this algorithm where the precision is really good. But you can see how sensitive this is, right? If we go from 0.1 down to 0.07, then all of a sudden our precision goes from 100 to 0. So this goes back to why I chose a logarithmic grid, because SVC is extremely sensitive to the choice of this C parameter. And before, our default value was about 1, so we were getting 83%, something like that. So this shows you a good way that you can validate your models. Not only validate your models, but use that validation routine to figure out how to better fit your models. So this is called, this process we did right here is called hyperparameter estimation. Hyperparameter, yeah. So when you call this fit, when you call fit on a model, you're doing parameter estimation. But there are these hyperparameters that drive what the parameters mean. And so you want to be able to fit on this meta estimator is a hyperparameter estimator. So we're finding the best hyperparameters.
So would you
Yeah.
use actually that optimal value, given the plot that you showed us before?
Yeah, I would. In this case, I wouldn't necessarily use just this value. I'd do a grid search over some of the other parameters as well.
Right, but let's say you're concentrated on that value.
Yeah.
Let's look at that plot you had on the parameters
Right here.
there. It's sitting on an edge of something very, very funny here. Right?
Yeah.
It's not robust.
Yeah. Yeah, so his point was this is not robust because if you change this parameter just slightly, you end up with a very, very different result.
Or if I change your input data, it won't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you change the input data just slightly. And this is the point I was going to get to, that remember before we did the train and the test split, and we found that you can overfit your data. You can basically memorize your training data, and that's why you need a test data in order to validate the training data. Same sort of thing can happen in hyperparameter estimation. Here we've basically, there's a possibility that we have overfit to our validation data in a sense. So what you really want is you want a third phase of validation where you look at some data that the validation scheme has never seen and see how well it does for that. And that way you can get away from this parameter sensitivity issue. Because really right here we may have overfit to our validation data. And that's another one of those subtle points that doesn't often come out in these sorts of talks. And in some of the longer tutorials that you can find on video online, I go into that a little bit more in depth. Does that make sense? I know it's kind of just a lot of words, but maybe I didn't describe it very well.
So how do you suggest kind of like not avoiding it, but I mean, yes, we are aware that you might be overcutting, but you don't want to do that.
Yeah. So how do I suggest?
The best way to, I don't know, maybe extra analysis or some robustness?
Yeah, the best way. The question was how do we avoid this? How do we make sure this isn't happening? And the way to do that is to have a hyper validation set. Basically, you set aside some of your data that doesn't go into any of this analysis, and then at the end you see how your final algorithm performs on that data. And if it's significantly worse than this right here, then that's an indication that you might have overfit the validation to your data set. So it's all about trying to figure out how you can apply your algorithm to data that the algorithm has never seen. So the best way to do that is to make sure there's some data the algorithm has never seen. Yeah. I was asking about the precision. Do we assume the sample is has the same number of trues and falses as the input? That's where stratified k-fold comes in, because that will actually make sure that those proportions are correct within each of your folds. So you want, for precision in particular, you want to make sure that you have kind of a uniform sampling of the data within each fold. Yeah. One more.
When you run the grid search, would you recommend running multiple hyperparameters within the param grid to get better accuracy? Is it complex? Or?
Yeah, yes. When you run the grid search, we recommend doing multiple hyperparameters. And I'd say yes in general. But of course, you if you have multiple hyperparameters, if I did 40 different C's and 40 different degrees, then all of a sudden you have 1,600 grid points. If I do another 40 in another hyperparameter, then I'm up to 40,000 or something, 50,000 grid points. So it grows really quickly, and it gets very, very difficult or very computationally intensive very quickly. If you want to know about the details of that, I would look up Olivier Grizel is another scikit-learn contributor, and he did a tutorial at PyCon last year that focuses on exactly that, how to do grid search in high dimensions effectively. And what he does is he uses randomized grid search. He uses IPython parallel to push this to an EC2 cluster, and gets some phenomenal results over really, really large dimensional grid searches very quickly. So again, it's Olivier Grizel, and you can look for the PyCon 2013 tutorial. I gave the introductory one, and he gave the advanced one, and he talks about that stuff. Olivier, just search. It's easier to search for PyCon 2013 tutorials scikit-learn, and you'll see PyCon, Pycon, and you'll see Olivier Grizel in there. If you want help finding it later, you can find me afterwards, and I'll point that out. So yeah, again, since we're sort of running short on time, I'm going to skip this exercise because basically what the exercise is meant to show is that you can use this for any estimator you want. You can try out different estimators, and different estimators have different characteristics of how they respond to changing their hyperparameters. And like I said with this, the fact that I chose logarithmic spacing for C here is due to the fact that I've done this before and I've sort of seen how C responds. So as you get more familiar with these machine learning techniques, you'll kind of get an intuitive feel for how the different algorithms respond to different hyperparameters, and that'll help you in your parameter searches. I should say that if you're interested in Kaggle, that kind of stuff, the 99% of doing well in a Kaggle competition is doing really good hyperparameter estimation. Like the people who win are the ones who spend thousands of computing hours, comparing different small, minute changes in hyperparameters to get that last 0.00001%. So I haven't spent much time on that because it just seems tedious. Anyway, so we have about, well, we don't have actually much time left at all. So there's this whole other section that I didn't get to, but I think I've put enough information into this that you can go through it yourself. And this is some interesting things interesting ways to figure out whether your model is overfitting, whether it's underfitting, whether it's high bias, whether it's high variance, and since I've put this online, I'll leave that for you guys to go through on your own. So yeah, we're just about out of time. Maybe a couple minutes if there are any last questions before we go. I guess we've had enough questions along the way that I'm probably satisfied with that. Let me go back here. I promised I would put this back up again. So just in conclusion, hopefully what I've instilled here is the fact that validation, cross-validation, model selection is a huge part of machine learning. Learning how to fit a model to data is only step one, and you're maybe about 10% of the way there once you fit your model to the data. And these sorts of cross-validation routines are built into scikit-learn. There are a lot of tools built in there, and there's a lot of information online, both in the scikit-learn documentation and in other video tutorials from past PyData conferences. And hopefully, if you're doing this sort of thing on your own, you'll find this stuff useful. I see one question in the back. Yeah, the question was, can you generate a model in scikit-learn and then pass it off to something like a Java API for production? I'm not extremely familiar with that. I think it's pretty hard, actually, to do that, unless you have some sort of Python instance running within your Java deployment. You can do something. One thing I know some people have done is these models. For example, like if you're using a linear model, the underlying model is simple enough that you could do this sort of exploration within scikit-learn, within Python, and figure out what your best model is, and then just implement the same model in whatever language you're deploying in. But right now, I don't think there's any good streamlined way to do that.
Actually,
Yeah.
there's a startup called YHat. I haven't used them, not affiliated, but you should check that out. They propose to do exactly that.
Okay, so someone mentioned this startup called YHat that will do that sort of thing. Yeah, one more question.
Yeah, all the examples that you went through were classifiers. If you're using regression models, is there something comparable for the cross-validation and a measure of goodness that you want to?
Yeah, it's a good question. He pointed out that everything I'd done here was classification, but yeah, there are similar things for regression. There are things like the R2 score, and if you go further on in that notebook, I actually do some regression examples for some of the other model fitting stuff. One more question.
So you talked about like feature selection being really difficult, but do you have any suggestions for like books or resources that you think might be useful to just sort of scratch the surface of that, even if it's maybe a little specific or something?
Yeah, the question was about feature selection and doing that effectively, and again, whether I have any ideas of books or resources. And I guess I'm stumped on that. I don't have a good thing to recommend. So if any of you know something or can come up with something and let me know, that'd be great, because then I could answer this question next time. But yeah, feature selection in general is hard and is very domain specific. Sorry. All right, well, we're out of time. I'm going to be around for the rest of the weekend, so if any other questions come up and you want to talk, I'll be around. And come to my NumPy computing tutorial this afternoon and enjoy the conference.